All right, thanks for joining me. My name is Wes Rice. I am a senior solutions architect here with VMware. Before I get started, just a little bit of background about me. I'm a native Louisvillian. I'm from this area. Taught for the University of Louisville for about 13 years. Stopped teaching about 3 years ago. So a lot of your members of your organization may have come through my class at one point in time. While I taught, I was out at Fort Knox as a chief architect or principal architect for U.S. Army Cadet Command, and also worked with Army Recruiting Command. So for the last few years, I've been working in a startup space. So I've just rejoined or joined VMware, and I'm happy to get a chance to be back here in the Louisville community. So thank you for hosting me here. So what we're going to be talking about today is Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a technical overview. So in this talk, what I kind of if setting some level expectations that you're familiar with things like cloud native, you're familiar with concepts like Kubernetes, you've heard of things like containers. So those aren't new concepts. And so what I want to do is kind of talk specifically about what the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is in relationship to some of these projects that are out there around Kubernetes. So we will go into a little bit of technical depth. It's not really deep in the weeds, but we do hit a little bit of technical depth. Now, I like to always start by framing the context, by kind of understanding where we're going. So let's do that by, this might be a little more technical, but have you ever installed Kubernetes? And if you have, I'd like you to think for a minute about what's involved with setting up a Kubernetes cluster. So if you're going to build a Kubernetes cluster, what types of things do you have to do? If you think about it, there's things like, you have to provision your resources. You have to have, let's just say, a simple cluster of one master and a couple of worker nodes. You might have 3 Ubuntu instances that you might have on vSphere, you might have on AWS or Azure, but you need the actual hardware, the VMs, where you're going to install your cluster. Then you're going to have to set up some tools. So maybe on your local machine or some box that you're working from, you need to set up kubectl, and you're going to have to configure it. You have to set up a CA. You have to set up TLS. You have to set up some auth files. You have to worry about kind of encryption. You have to get all of that set up. Once you've done that, then the first thing you need to do out on those kind of 3 nodes is set up an etcd cluster. That etcd cluster, then you need to define one of those nodes to be your master and the other 2 to be your worker nodes. You'll need to set up that kubectl access that you're going to be interacting with that for remote access. You'll need to go in, grab the config file, bring it down to be able to talk to them. Now, then at this point, you need to go in and configure each one of these to be worker nodes and to be the master node. Once you've done that, you have a workable cluster, but you can't actually get access to it. You still got to do things like set up some of your pod networking. There's some networking considerations that you have to make there. You have to do things like set up your ingress control, do things like deploy core DNS. You have to make decisions on your container runtimes. That networking implementation I was talking about, or you can use Flannel, Calico, Weaveworks, Cilium. You can use Canal. All those things are decisions you have to make, and you need to kind of double click and dive in and understand, what does Cilium give you? What does eBPF give you, for example, in context of a Kubernetes cluster versus maybe something like Flannel. So you have to double click and kind of go into it. Then there's things that you have to think about, like authentication. How are you going to handle between each of your nodes in multiple clusters if you do that? How are you going to handle authentication? How are you going to handle logging? What's your strategy for bringing all those together? Setting up a Kubernetes cluster, there's a lot of decisions to make. If you think about, there's a picture out there of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the landscape. It is a massive picture that has a lot of different options within the cloud native ecosystem that you need to have a good passable working knowledge on to understand. And everything I just described is for one cluster. Today, building your own Kubernetes cluster means making all these decisions, scripting it, and setting it up for that one environment. Now, what if you have multiple environments? What if you have on-prem? What if you have AWS or Azure or GCP or even a bare metal provider like something like Packet? Well, those scripts and those configurations have to be customized for each one of those. And when they change, when they release new hardware, you have to update it, or it may break your configuration for deploying your cluster. That's what it means to roll your own clusters today in the Kubernetes world. Now, I tell you that, by the way, if you haven't yet, and if you're interested and if you've built clusters, a great way, a great reference to go check out is Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes Hardware. He actually dives in and goes through some of these things on how to set it up all the difficult way. Now, I tell you this because Kubernetes or Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is designed to address all of that, to simplify the process. Tanzu TKG, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, is an engineered solution that offers simplified installation. I'll talk a bit about what that means. It provides automated multi-cluster lifecycle. That means creating, deleting, updating, managing a cluster, applying policies to a cluster. It provides these services. And then it's an integrated platform that makes opinionated choices about some of the things that you'll find within the CNCF.